Before smartphones were common, personal digital assistants, or PDAs, quickly grew in popularity around the turn of the millennium. While some had limited features in order to focus on affordability, one manufacturer decided to go for the high end of the market, and produced very compelling devices in the process. In the 90s, there were a few different options if you wanted a PDA, but the most popular ones were from Palm Computing. Their handwriting recognition took a little getting used to, but it was fairly accurate. And while at first they didn't boast the most extensive feature set, they were very effective at what they set out to do. The Palm brand changed hands a few times, from US Robotics to 3Com, and eventually being spun out as its own company. Along the way, Palm decided that licensing its OS to other manufacturers would help expand its installed base, and in short order, several companies jumped on board. Some produced devices meant for specific purposes, such as managing inventory in a warehouse, while others targeted general consumer use. Most of these were budget-conscious models, but Sony decided it wanted in on the action and released a lineup of its Clie handhelds at varying price points. By the early 2000s, the Palm OS had gained a number of multimedia and networking features, meant as a way to compete against not just the rapidly growing MP3 player and digital camera markets, but also Microsoft's PocketPC. Palm had led the market by a wide margin, but PocketPC devices saw a large increase in sales as Microsoft tried to target Palm's relatively slow software development. Sony took advantage of Palm's newfound necessity to compete and started releasing devices that leveraged the new features. Some looked like ordinary Palm devices, but with digital cameras tucked into the corner and headphone jacks for music playback. Others, though, broke away from the traditional handheld form factor and really pushed what the Palm OS was capable of. One such model was the PEG UX50 from July of 2003. At first glance, it looks like a tiny laptop with a full keyboard, scroll wheel, and shortcut keys. The stylus stowed along the front edge, and there was a mini USB port on the left side for transferring data. But the screen could rotate 180 degrees and flip back down, so the UX50 could offer a more typical interface. Before I could explore this one a bit more, though, I needed to fix two major problems. The bottom panel was bulging outwards, which was a sure sign of a swollen battery pack. Somewhat curiously, Sony opted to use pentalobe screws to hold the unit together. These were very uncommon at the time, but in typical Sony fashion, actually disassembling the handheld was straightforward. The bottom panel is made of metal, and I was thankful that it sprung back to its original shape. Sure enough, the lithium-ion cell had puffed up quite a bit, so I got it disconnected and removed. Surprisingly, it's possible to still buy third-party replacements for these, so I picked one up and dropped it in. That took care of the battery situation, but I was left with another issue. How was I supposed to recharge it? For some reason, the mini USB port could only be used for data transfer, not charging, with the latter requiring the use of a cradle and special power adapter. Problem is, those were missing when I got my UX50, and because they're specific to the model and accessories like these often get lost over time, buying a replacement was a very expensive proposition. After waiting a while, a listing popped up on Yahoo Auctions Japan for a UX50 that included its cradle, and I managed to win it for a much more reasonable price. It didn't include the AC adapter, which at first I was concerned about, but I was relieved when I discovered an adapter I already had for a different Clie model would also work. It's frustrating that Sony liked to use proprietary solutions like this, but at least the company was consistent about it. My Japanese UX50 was slightly different in its keyboard layout, but had the exact same problem with a swollen battery, which I also replaced. These units run Palm OS 5 and feature color LCDs with a resolution of 480 by 320 pixels. Being a Sony product, there's a memory stick card slot on the right side, along with a headphone jack. But what makes this model especially interesting is what's hidden inside the screen hinge. It's a camera module capable of taking photos at 640 by 480 pixel resolution, or video clips at roughly a third that size. It rotates through 270 degrees to accommodate various shooting angles, or it can face inward to protect the lens when in a pocket or bag. By today's standards, the image quality is absolutely horrible, but in the early 2000s, when digital cameras were still gaining traction, having this feature integrated into a PDA was fairly compelling. Even more interesting is the device's communication capabilities. Most Palm OS device owners had gotten used to the hot sync process. Drop the device in its cradle or hook up the cable and wait while data is exchanged with a host PC. Sony opted to embrace wireless communication and built in both 802.11b Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth. This meant that one could do things like send and receive email or surf the web without needing to wait for a hot sync. And with the UX50's multimedia capabilities, Sony referred to the model as a personal entertainment organizer instead of just a PDA. Most Palm devices came with a fairly basic set of built-in applications, but the UX50 was a bit more substantial in this regard, with a variety of audio, photo, and video apps, all suited to the device's hardware. Sony also opted to customize the UI. It's a bit, shall we say, busy looking, but also does a good job taking advantage of the screen's relatively high resolution. And if you didn't like it, you could easily flip over to the default Palm OS home screen design instead. But the UX50 wasn't the only Clie model to boast this kind of feature set. Another from around the same time was the NX80. Instead of looking like a tiny laptop, it resembled an oversized flip phone, but still sporting a full keyboard where the dial pad would normally be. The NX80 was similar to the UX50 in some ways and different in others. It had a memory stick slot and headphone jack with the scroll wheel and back button moved to the left side. It also had the same trick folding screen so it could be used more like a traditional PDA, and Sony even thoughtfully duplicated the shortcut buttons for use in that mode. Overall, the NX80 was bigger to allow for a larger screen, and instead of built-in mini USB, it used Sony's own connector for data transfer and charging. Like the UX50s I picked up, its battery was dead, and accessing it was straightforward, just a single Phillips screw to hold the cover on. But because the cell had expanded a bit, it wasn't able to be slid out easily, and I had to remove the two case screws at the bottom to free up enough space. While I ordered a replacement battery for this one too, unfortunately it didn't seem to have an effect. Even with the handheld plugged in, it didn't want to power on. Considering that it indicates it's charging, it's not terribly likely that the new battery is defective, so it seems there's something deeper that's wrong with the unit. In any case, it's a bummer I wasn't able to fully check out and demonstrate its capabilities. The larger hinge for the screen allowed for a bigger camera module, so Sony upgraded the NX80 to a 1.3 megapixel sensor with flash, and even included a neutral density filter for shooting in bright sunlight. This would of course take larger photos, so having a memory card was much more important. Both models we looked at only included a few dozen megabytes of user storage built in. And while Sony was keen to push its proprietary memory stick format, it also included a compact flash card slot that would pop out of the back. This was a clever solution to a feature the NX80 had to give up, that being wireless communication. An optional Wi-Fi card would fit into that slot, though regular compact flash memory cards worked just fine as well. The only downside was that using either made the Clie a bit bulkier, since there wasn't enough space inside the device to allow the door to close with a card inserted. While typing on the UX50 was slow but manageable, the keyboard on the NX80 was an exercise in frustration. Unless you had especially small fingers or long fingernails, the tiny keys felt incredibly cramped, and being flush with the faceplate didn't help matters either. Thankfully, the device still supported the generally effective graffiti handwriting recognition built into Palm OS, and the NX80 also featured another, more natural recognition algorithm licensed from Swedish company Decuma. Perhaps unsurprisingly, neither model was inexpensive. They both featured high build quality, and with so many features packed in, they sold for premium prices. At launch, the UX50 went for about $650 US, while the NX80 was just a little less. Of course, a robust selection of interesting accessories also fought to make your wallet lighter, such as folding keyboards, game controllers, and speaker docks. Compared to the prices of typical Palm PDAs at the time, these were astronomical, especially since Palm's own hardware saw price cuts in early 2003 due to that pressure from PocketPC. A basic Palm Zyre 21 went for all of $100, and a Tungsten E was $200. And while the latter lacked wireless communication or a camera, it supported multimedia playback from an SD card. Sony competed in that space as well, with its Clie SJ20 priced just a bit more than the Zyre, but offering a few more features. It perhaps goes without saying, though, that Sony's higher-end Clie models didn't exactly fly off the shelves, though they did have a small but devoted fan base. PDAs in general saw a gradual decline in popularity through the early 2000s, eventually becoming irrelevant with the rise of smartphones. But in 2003, those were still generally out of the reach of most consumers. Devices like the UX50 and NX80 were the next best thing, and provided a glimpse of what was to come.